Why does Spider-Man always have to suffer, both on and off the screen? Listen to this. Spider-Man won over generations of fans, broke records, and changed superhero movies forever. But there's one detail almost nobody mentions. None of his franchises ever finished the way they were supposed to. Every single one was cut short, rebooted, or altered. Sam Raimi wanted to make a fourth installment in the 2000s that got shelved forever. Andrew Garfield had to hide his frustration when his trilogy was canceled. And let's not even get into all the drama between Sony and Marvel over the character. What was it that always went wrong? And the question I have for you is, will this new movie finally be able to change our hero's fate? To understand the importance of this new sequel, we have to go back in time and look at all the previous versions. Some of them might not even be remembered by the most hardcore fans. The truth is, behind the web-slinger lies a history full of failed projects, power struggles, and decisions that hurt the superhero more than any of his villains. If you enjoy our videos, please don't hesitate to share them. For some reason, there are times when our videos get fewer than 1,000 views, and that makes it really hard to keep the same level of quality as always. When you like, subscribe, and share the video, you're helping us keep the channel alive. Long before becoming one of Hollywood's most successful franchises, Spider-Man was a character that seemed impossible to adapt. His first leap out of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's comic books was the 1967 animated series Spider-Man, just 5 years after the creation of young Peter Parker. Audiences loved the character, his adventures, and that iconic opening theme song, but success wasn't enough to save the show. In 1970, it was canceled due to budget issues. Still, it proved that the wall crawler could successfully expand into other formats. The first live-action Spider-Man didn't come from the movies, but from television. In 1977, CBS aired The Amazing Spider-Man series, starring Nicholas Hammond. Even though it took a lot of liberties with the original comic, it was well received. However, it only lasted for one season. Production costs were too high, and CBS didn't want to be typecast as the superhero network. At the time, they were also airing Wonder Woman and The Incredible Hulk. Even so, several episodes were stitched together into 3 feature films and released in international theaters. These early steps established a pattern that would follow Spider-Man forever. He was always a hit with audiences, but ultimately became a victim of outside factors. Thanks to the massive success of Superman the movie in 1978, Hollywood started searching for new heroes to bring to the big screen. Spider-Man seemed like the perfect candidate, but instead, he got stuck in development hell. In the early 80s, Marvel was going through a tough time financially and sold the film rights to the Cannon Group. This independent production company was run by Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, 2 Israeli cousins with a great sense for business, but absolutely zero comic book knowledge. In fact, they actually thought Spider-Man was a monster. Their initial idea was to turn it into a horror movie where Peter transformed into a literal 8-legged creature. They even hired director Tobe Hooper, the guy behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and considered a young Tom Cruise for the lead role. However, Marvel was absolutely horrified by this approach and shut the project down immediately. Even so, Cannon didn't give up. They commissioned a new script that was much more faithful to the comic, pitting Spider-Man against a classic villain, Dr. Octopus. They brought on Joseph Zito, one of their in-house directors, and the role of Spider-Man went to Scott Leva, who even posed for official promotional photos in the suit. But it all fell apart. The estimated budget came in at $20 million, which was completely impossible for the company. Golan and Globus tried one more time with director Albert Pune, who suggested making the movie for just $4 million by filming it at the same time as the sequel to Masters of the Universe. In the end, neither movie got made. The company owed Marvel a massive amount of money and went bankrupt shortly after. On top of that, public interest in superheroes had seemingly faded away. The landscape changed in 1989 when Tim Burton's Batman became a massive hit and Hollywood regained its faith in superheroes. Golan had held on to the Spider-Man rights, so he founded the production company 21st Century and announced Stephen Herrick as the director. The idea was to make a teen adventure closely tied to the comic books, but once again, the project was canceled due to financial issues. It seemed like Spider-Man would never get his own official movie, until Coralco Pictures acquired the rights and hired James Cameron. As a fan of the character, he wrote a 57-page script treatment that introduced the idea of Peter having organic web shooters. Cameron wanted to give the lead role to a rising star named Leonardo DiCaprio, and rumor had it that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to play Dr. Octopus. There was a clear vision, a huge budget, and plenty of excitement, until Coralco went bankrupt, sparking a long legal battle over the rights, and the project completely vanished. And as we know, Cameron and DiCaprio ended up boarding the Titanic instead. After years of failed attempts, Spider-Man was starting to look like a cursed production. That is, until the late 90s, when Sony Pictures bought the rights and promised to finally deliver the movie both Hollywood and the fans had been dreaming of. For a few years, it seemed like Sony had found the perfect formula, but their biggest success also ended up becoming the start of a new conflict. The project landed in the hands of two figures who would be key to the superhero's cinematic journey: Amy Pascal, who was the president of Columbia Pictures at the time, and producer Avi Arad. However, the real turning point was bringing on Sam Raimi. He had already revolutionized horror with the Evil Dead franchise, and with Darkman, he proved he could handle a superhero movie. Most importantly, he was a massive Spider-Man fan. His vision was crystal clear. Rather than just making an action movie, he wanted to tell the story of a young man discovering the weight of responsibility while trying to win over the girl he loves. So, he crafted a story where Peter gets his powers and faces off against the Green Goblin, all while connecting with his neighbor Mary Jane Watson. Fans celebrated bringing Raimi on board, but everyone was wondering who would play Spider-Man. Sony was looking for a bigger star, but the director leaned toward the relatively unknown Tobey Maguire. He defended his choice because he felt Maguire truly captured the character's humanity. He was joined by Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane and Willem Dafoe playing the Green Goblin. The gamble was an absolute success. Released in 2002, it captivated audiences with its mix of spectacle, humor, and drama. It cost $140 million and grossed over $800 million, winning over longtime fans and capturing a brand new audience. And most importantly, it kickstarted the modern era of superhero movies. No one was surprised when Spider-Man 2 was announced. Though this is where the problems began. Maguire almost walked away from the project. He had injured his back while filming Seabiscuit and was in the middle of a pay dispute with Sony. As tensions rose, Dunst suggested that the character be played by her boyfriend at the time, Jake Gyllenhaal. In the end, Maguire recovered, and Pascal agreed to raise his salary to $17 million. By the way, the executive had just been promoted to co-chair of Sony. Meanwhile, Raimi could finally focus on the movie he actually wanted to make, a story about the conflict between Peter's personal life and his responsibilities as Spider-Man, who was now facing off against Dr. Octopus. After all that turbulence, Spider-Man 2 became an even bigger commercial and artistic hit. Today, it's widely considered the best movie featuring the character and a true masterpiece of superhero cinema. But while audiences were celebrating, some deep divides were starting to form inside the studio. For Spider-Man 3, Raimi wanted to tell a story about forgiveness and redemption, focusing on Peter and Sandman, the main villain. But Arad had other plans. He forced the director to include Venom because he was a huge fan favorite. Years later, the director would admit that his version of Venom failed simply because he never understood the character and never actually wanted him in his movie. But that wasn't all. Pascal backed the producer and demanded they also add Gwen Stacy to create a love triangle with Mary Jane. We'll talk more later in this video about the differences between Peter's love interests in the original comic books and Hollywood's interpretations. But for now, let's just say the director reluctantly agreed to these terms. In the end, Spider-Man 3 was another box office hit, but it didn't win over fans or critics. Everyone pointed out that the movie was overloaded with characters and subplots. Even so, Sony announced Spider-Man 4, which never happened. At first, Raimi wanted to take back creative control. This time around, Spider-Man was going to face the Vulture, who would be played by John Malkovich. The director also included Black Cat, a role meant for Anne Hathaway. But once again, Sony and Arad interfered. For starters, they both pushed to include cameos from more classic villains. As a result, the script went through multiple rewrites by several writers, and Raimi wasn't happy with any of the drafts. To make matters worse, the studio locked in a strict release date for May 2011. And on top of that, rumors were growing that Sony was already planning to reboot the character. Fed up with the whole situation, Raimi called Pascal and told her, "I don't want to make a movie that is less than great. Just go ahead with the reboot you're already planning anyway." And just like that, the first Spider-Man saga came to an abrupt end. Thinking Raimi was the problem, Sony decided to start from scratch, but a whole new set of problems was right around the corner. After Raimi left, Sony didn't just want to reboot the franchise, they had to get a movie into production immediately, or the rights would revert back to Marvel. They quickly hired director Mark Webb, who had just made waves with his feature debut, 500 Days of Summer. Shortly after, they announced the new Peter Parker, Andrew Garfield, who was quickly becoming a breakout star thanks to The Social Network. Soon we got the title of the reboot, The Amazing Spider-Man, along with Peter's new love interest, Gwen Stacy. It's worth stopping for a moment to clear up a few details for people who are only fans of the movies and aren't as familiar with the comic books. Even though audiences of Raimi's trilogy had gotten used to Dunst's Mary Jane, Gwen Stacy was actually Peter's first real love. Created in 1965, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko included her in the original story to represent the stability the masked hero desperately craved. However, the writers producers knew a perfect life would stall the character's growth, which ultimately led to her tragic death in 1973, turning her into an eternal symbol of an idealized romance. Mary Jane Watson debuted in 1966 as her exact opposite, an outgoing, lively party girl who grew up alongside Peter. She went from being a secondary love interest to becoming his strongest, most grounded emotional pillar, eventually becoming his wife. Ultimately, both characters were designed to shape Peter's journey into adulthood. Even though we see endless variants across the multiverse today, their original purpose remains the exact same: to force the hero to find a balance between his personal desires and his destiny as Spider-Man. With this background in mind, Webb wanted to set his version apart from the previous franchise by taking a more faithful and realistic approach. He drew inspiration from the Ultimate line of comics and Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. He brought back the mechanical web shooters, introduced the Lizard as the main villain, and put the focus on the relationship between Peter and Gwen, played by Emma Stone. He also added a mystery surrounding the disappearance of Peter's parents. Every single idea was approved by Arad and Pascal, who were already busy figuring out how to expand this new universe. When The Amazing Spider-Man hit theaters in 2012, it faced a bit of pushback. It had only been 10 years since Raimi's first movie, and audiences were being asked to sit through the character's origin story all over again. Even so, the movie was a commercial hit and earned positive reviews, especially for the work of Webb, Garfield, and Stone. Sony had every reason to believe they had successfully launched a new franchise, and they quickly announced The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is where things got complicated. Webb, Garfield, and Stone wanted to keep exploring the relationship between Peter and Gwen, but the producers had other plans. This time around, Spider-Man was going to face off against three villains: Electro, played by Jamie Foxx, along with appearances from Harry Osborn's Green Goblin and the Rhino. Once again, the franchise was getting overcrowded with villains, and they wouldn't be the only additions. Arad and Pascal were keeping a close eye on the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so they wanted to build their own shared universe around Spider-Man. That decision changed the project completely. From that moment on, Webb had to inject more mystery surrounding Peter's missing parents and lay the groundwork for the Sinister Six, a team made up of some of Spidey's most iconic villains. Pascal and Arad were so confident in their plan that they announced The Amazing Spider-Man 3 for June 2016, The Amazing Spider-Man 4 for 2018, and two spin-offs, one focused on the Sinister Six and another centered around Venom. But those plans started to fall apart in May 2014, when The Amazing Spider-Man 2 failed to meet expectations. It had a budget of $240 million, not counting marketing costs, and grossed $712 million worldwide, a lower number than the first movie, and the lowest for any Spider-Man film up to that point. Just like with Spider-Man 3, audiences and critics alike complained about the messy jumble of subplots and villains. The underwhelming box office performance of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 complicated Sony's plans, but things completely unraveled because of something much worse. In November 2014, the studio suffered one of the biggest cyber attacks in Hollywood history, a story we've actually covered in another video. Thousands of emails and internal documents were leaked to the public, including private conversations about Spider-Man. Most importantly, the most sensitive piece of information got out. Sony was secretly negotiating with Marvel Studios, who wanted to bring the wall crawler into their cinematic universe. Because of that corporate crisis, the shared universe Arad and Pascal had been dreaming of was canceled. She stepped down as president of Sony, although she stayed with the company and kept her role as a producer on Spider-Man. The creative team wasn't so lucky. Webb, Garfield, Stone, and everyone else involved were quietly let go. Shortly after, the director spoke out about all the studio mandates he had to put up with. The actor also pointed out that the original script had a lot of heart, but it was butchered for commercial interests. Just like that, the second Spider-Man franchise also came to an abrupt end. Sony had swapped out the director, the star, and the tone, but they were still running into the exact same problems. Then, exactly what the hack had revealed finally happened. After years of competing against each other, Sony and Marvel joined forces for the sake of the superhero. It seemed like the ultimate fix, but it was really just the start of a complicated new chapter. After years of abandoned projects and two unfinished franchises, it seemed like Spider-Man had finally found a home. Marvel Studios and Sony reached a historic agreement. Spider-Man would join the Marvel Cinematic Universe under the creative supervision of Kevin Feige, while Sony, with Pascal as the face of the operation, would finance, distribute, and keep the profits from the standalone movies. It was a deal that seemed like a win-win for everyone, until things went sour. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The initial announcements were also pretty promising. To succeed Maguire and Garfield, the production cast Tom Holland. The British actor landed the role thanks to his talent and athletic abilities. Plus, he was just 20 years old and could actually pull off playing the character during his high school years. For his love interest, MJ, they went with a then lesser-known Zendaya. Directing duties went to John Watts, who came from the indie film scene. He checked all the boxes the studios were looking for. He was a massive fan of the character, he had plenty of enthusiasm, and his name wasn't big enough to try and overrule the producer's ideas. Before starring in Spider-Man: Homecoming, Holland made his debut in Captain America: Civil War. His appearance was brief, but it was enough to convince audiences that Marvel had found a fresh, rejuvenated take on Spidey. The partnership between Marvel and Sony actually worked. In Spider-Man: Homecoming, Feige skipped retelling the character's origin story and brought him straight into the Marvel Cinematic Universe through his relationship with Tony Stark. With a $175 million budget, the movie grossed $880 million. Fans completely fell for Holland's fresh take, proving that the character could successfully reinvent himself one more time. The winning streak kept going in 2019 with the sequel, Spider-Man: Far From Home. The movie made over $1.1 billion, becoming the first film for the character to cross the billion-dollar mark. On top of that, the superhero reunited with his peers in Avengers: Infinity War, where he was wiped out by Thanos, only to return in Avengers: Endgame to help save the world. Meanwhile, Holland and Zendaya became massive stars and even started dating in real life. It seemed like things were finally looking up for Spider-Man, until it all went dark. In August 2019, Disney tried to renegotiate the deal with Sony. Up until then, Marvel was getting 5% of the box office for the standalone movies, but now they wanted to take a much more active role in financing and grab a much bigger cut of the profits. When Sony rejected the offer, Disney announced that Feige would no longer produce the franchise. So for a while, the wall-crawler was kicked out of the MCU and went right back to belonging exclusively to Sony. That corporate split absolutely infuriated Spider-Man fans, sparking massive protests across social media. It also put the development of the third movie, Spider-Man: No Way Home, in serious jeopardy. John Watts and the writers had to scramble to put together a script that didn't feature a single Marvel character or element. Instead, they tossed around an idea built entirely on nostalgia, having Holland's Spider-Man share the screen with the Maguire and Garfield version. The divorce between Disney and Sony felt like a done deal, right up until Holland himself stepped in. Using his leverage, he personally called Disney CEO Bob Iger and Sony CEO Tom Rothman, convincing them to go back to the negotiating table. His push actually worked. After a tense month, they signed a brand new agreement where Disney would cover 25% of the budget in exchange for 25% of the profits. Everyone in Hollywood knew it was just a temporary truce, but it gave the team exactly what they needed to finish the third installment. Because of that, Spider-Man: No Way Home turned into a bigger event than anyone could have ever imagined. That backup plan of bringing all three Spider-Men together wasn't just kept around by Marvel. Kevin Feige made sure it became the movie's main selling point. On top of that, Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin and several other iconic villains from past franchises would also be making a comeback. Spider-Man: No Way Home was more than just a massive hit. It grossed over $1.95 billion, becoming the biggest triumph in the character's entire history. Even people who were never fans went crazy over the crossover between Holland, Maguire, and Garfield. In fact, campaigns popped up demanding the veterans return for more movies and finally make the canceled Spider-Man 4 and The Amazing Spider-Man 3. But while Spider-Man: No Way Home cemented itself as a cultural phenomenon, superhero movies were starting to show signs of superhero fatigue. Marvel was no longer a bulletproof studio, and audience enthusiasm was beginning to drop. Even Holland himself mentioned he wasn't sure if he wanted to keep playing Peter for the rest of his life. Spider-Man had reached the highest point in his history, right as the world around him began to shift. And meanwhile, Sony was about to find out that not even their highly successful animated movies were safe from behind-the-scenes drama. Alongside their work with Marvel, Sony kept moving forward with other Spider-Man projects. They produced the standalone Venom movie, which launched a trilogy, as well as other features centered around his villains. But their main priority was still Spider-Man himself. Back during the 2014 hack, it was also revealed that the studio was planning another take on the superhero, this time as an animated feature. To make it happen, Pascal brought in Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, two writer-producers who knew exactly how to balance humor, heart, and creative risk. That's why they decided to center the story on Miles Morales. Specifically, they wanted to adapt the Spider-Verse comic, where he interacts with two different versions of Peter Parker. The whole concept was a massive gamble. Not only were they betting on a Spider-Man that mainstream audiences weren't familiar with, but they were also completely breaking the visual mold of commercial animation. And the results shattered all expectations. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse cost $90 million to make and grossed $395 million. On top of that, it earned universal critical acclaim and even won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature, an unheard-of achievement for a superhero movie. Audiences everywhere fell in love with Miles, and his existence even became officially canon. In No Way Home, Electro tells Garfield's Spidey he thought he was black, and mentions there just has to be a black Spider-Man out there somewhere. After so many conflicts with the live-action movies, it seemed like Sony had finally found a drama-free Spider-Man franchise. But that peace didn't last long. Thanks to the success of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Pascal announced a sequel. Lord and Miller came up with a massive, ambitious story that was just too big for a single movie. So they decided to split it into two films: Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, set to be released in April 2022, and Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse, scheduled for 2023. The plan was to produce both movies at the same time, but nothing went according to plan. Due to delays in finishing the script and slow progress on the animation, the release of the first sequel was pushed back to June 2023. It wasn't until that new date was set that Lord and Miller finally approved a script, initial sketches, and designs. From that moment on, the crew was racing against the clock, working 11-hour days, 7 days a week. The burnout became so extreme that over 100 animators ended up quitting. After that race against time, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse hit theaters right on schedule and was an even bigger success until the scandal broke. A few days after the release, Vulture published an article featuring statements from several of the animators who had quit. Every single one of them spoke out about the terrible working conditions they were forced to endure. They also pointed to Lord as the main person responsible. According to them, he kept tweaking scenes that were practically finished, forcing the crew to redo entire sequences and keeping everyone under constant pressure. On top of that, the directors criticized Arad and Pascal for not stepping in to stop the mistreatment. And finally, they revealed that absolutely nothing had been animated yet for Beyond the Spider-Verse, making the 2024 release date a complete lie. In the midst of all this controversy, the media reached out to Lord for a statement. He tried to downplay the situation, saying he was proud of how hard his team had worked, but he never offered the apology that so many people were expecting. Pascal also spoke out, and she didn't hold back. If the story isn't right, you have to keep going until it is. Welcome to making a movie. Because of those comments, the entire industry sparked a massive debate about the working conditions for animation and visual effects artists. After the fallout, the production of Beyond the Spider-Verse went through a major restructuring. Lord and Miller rewrote a large chunk of the story, the workflow was reorganized, and Sony delayed the release until June 18, 2027. But one thing was certain, not even the most innovative take on Spider-Man could escape behind-the-scenes trouble. And while Sony was busy trying to sort out the future of Miles Morales, Tom Holland's fourth Spider-Man movie was starting to pile up red flags that looked entirely too much like the franchise's past disasters. After the success of Spider-Man No Way Home, it seemed like Sony and Marvel had finally found common ground. But like we mentioned earlier, the new agreement between the two studios was barely a truce, meant to cover up a much deeper conflict. The studios planned to bring back the winning team from the previous three movies, including director John Watts. But in 2022, he walked away from the franchise. He said he was suffering from extreme burnout due to the immense pressure of making the third installment, which he considered to be the definitive ending. On top of dealing with strict pandemic filming protocols, he was simply sick and tired of the constant demands from both companies. Watts' departure exposed another major underlying issue. Holland and Marvel wanted to pick the story up right where No Way Home left off, following an anonymous Peter Parker as he swings around New York and potentially teams up with Daredevil. Sony, on the other hand, wanted to double down on the multiverse and dreamed of reuniting Holland, Maguire, and Garfield all over again. Add to that the massive delays caused by the 2023 writers and actors strikes. Tensions between the studios started to rise again, right up until Feige stepped in. In late 2024, with the strike finally over, he hired new writers and a new director, Destin Daniel Cretton, who had just scored a huge win for Marvel with Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Feige believed Cretton knew how to balance action choreography with emotional depth, and more importantly, that he could juggle the expectations of both studios. Little by little, the movie took shape and even got a new title, Spider-Man Brand New Day. With the project back on track, Sony and Marvel locked in a release date, July 31st, 2026. For Feige, it was absolutely crucial that it came out around the same time as his studio's biggest upcoming projects, Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. Because of that, the script also had to be tweaked to make sure Peter's character arc would line up perfectly with his peers in those future movies. With everything ready to start filming Spider-Man Brand New Day, all that was left was getting Holland and Zendaya back together, which turned out to be yet another hurdle. The couple had basically become a magnet for Hollywood. In fact, they were both set to star together again in The Odyssey. Leveraging his influence within the franchise, the actor asked Sony to delay filming on Brand New Day so he could go work with Nolan. Desperate not to lose their leading man, Sony completely rearranged their schedule so he could shoot both productions. After a tough pre-production, Spider-Man Brand New Day was filmed during the second half of 2025. On top of the pressure to hit their release date, there was an extreme level of secrecy surrounding the movie. The production brought on Stranger Things star Sadie Sink, but they never actually told her what part she'd be playing. The actress said she agreed to do the movie, signed her contract, and traveled to the set, all without reading a single line of the script or even knowing who she was supposed to be. Naturally, this sparked an endless wave of fan theories, with most people convinced she's going to play a brand new version of the X-Men's Jean Grey. But the real challenge for Spider-Man Brand New Day wasn't actually on set. After years of dominating the box office, Marvel movies were starting to underperform, and audience hype was noticeably fading. And this fatigue wasn't just hitting the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A huge chunk of the superhero genre and massive blockbusters in general were going through a period of deep uncertainty. Because of this, the wall crawler's newest adventure ended up carrying a massive amount of weight on its shoulders. It wasn't just another Spider-Man movie, it also had to prove that the character could still draw a massive crowd and carry a franchise at a time when absolutely nothing felt invincible anymore. At this point, an inevitable question comes up. Why does Spider-Man always have to suffer both on and off the screen? Maybe the problem was never a specific movie, a director, or a studio. Maybe the conflict is built into the character himself. To understand that, we need to look back at his origin. As we mentioned earlier, Spider-Man was created in 1962 by writer Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko, following Marvel's core philosophy, superheroes with real-world problems. Spider-Man wasn't a god or a billionaire. He was a brilliant teenager whose life just never stopped getting complicated. He lost loved ones, struggled with money, failed at romance, and constantly had to sacrifice his own happiness to do the right thing. That constant tension is the essence of the character. That works perfectly in a comic book because every story ends by setting up a brand new conflict. Hollywood, however, demands neat franchises and satisfying endings. Spider-Man, on the other hand, always ends up right back at square one, always loses something, and always has to start all over again. Spider-Man cemented his status as a pop culture icon through highly successful franchises, but that glory was always tainted by problems. His cinematic history has been full of adaptations that never happened, franchises that ended on a sour note, and heavy corporate tensions. Now, Spider-Man Brand New Day promises to break that cycle, but we should probably be careful. If over 50 years of adaptations have taught us anything, it's that Spider-Man was born to live in conflict, and his true enemy was never the Green Goblin, Venom, or Dr. Octopus. It was always Hollywood. If you think the story behind Spider-Man was crazy and that Peter Parker is just an unlucky guy, it's because you haven't heard about everything Wolfgang Peterson went through to get Troy made. Luckily, here's a video all about its production.